Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 9 of Book Musings. In this episode, I'll take a look at Stephen King's Under the Dome. Yes, another Stephen King novel. This is the third in a row that I've read. You might say that I've caught King fever, if you will. Not only is it the third one, it's the third gigantic novel of his. Of course, he's known for writing pretty robust books, and this was no exception. This is actually the longest book I've ever read. Clocking in at 1,074 pages. So obviously he's doing something right. If I'm reading 3 of his books in a short period of time, and they're all fairly long. So like I mentioned, I will take a look this time around at Under the Dome. I'll give you, as I typically do, a little bit of background, why it is I came to read this book, tell you a little bit about what the book's about, and then I'll offer some musings, some of my thoughts on the novel, and then I'll end by offering my Book Musings grade. Will this book make the highly coveted Book Musings Hall of Fame and maybe even the top shelf? We've only had one book so far. Of course, this is only the 9th episode, right? But only one so far has made the top shelf. We shall see if, well, 1 out of 8 so far, right? We shall see if Under the Dome is the second one. So that's the game plan. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. So a little bit of a background. If you've watched either of the last 2 episodes, you know that I've been, again, I had King fever lately, you might say, and I won't go into my history with Stephen King too much here because, again, I've already covered that at length pretty much in episode 7 where I talked about Do McKee, which is here somewhere, one of his novels. That's the first one I read, so again, episode 7, and then I read 11/22/63. The previous episode of Book Musings, episode 8, I covered that one. And so again, these were the last 2 novels I read, and I knew before reading 11/22/63 it was either that one or Under the Dome. They both looked really appealing. Again, Do McKee, as I discussed in episode 7, it was definitely well written, sparked my attention. While I wasn't a big fan of the ending, I knew I wanted to keep reading King a bit, and again, so those 2, 11/22/63 and Under the Dome, were the top 2 candidates. Went with 11/22/63, did an episode on that, and then after I knocked that one out, went ahead and moved on to Under the Dome. So that was kind of the impetus, if you will, for me, how I came to read Under the Dome. Again, just really into, for whatever reason, King as of late. So, and I mentioned in the previous few episodes that I'm not one who reads a lot of fiction these days. I loved fiction growing up, read a ton. I have read a lot of novels over the course of my life, but I tend to read nonfiction, and I tend to always read, as I've alluded to in the previous episodes, with a pencil, constantly, whether it's a fiction or nonfiction, constantly marking up the books. And that's been the exception here. Then I've kind of gone with some fiction here, a steady string of fiction, steady diet of Stephen King in particular, and I have not had that pencil with me the entire time. So it's been kind of a break, if you will, from heavy-duty scrutinizing of the texts as I read. And, that's been a breath of fresh air. But anyway, just wanted to mention that it's been kind of a little different in that sense. Also, while I'm thinking about it, I can't remember if I mentioned all the movies that Stephen King, that his works have been, adapted into movies and TV shows and so on. And Under the Dome's actually no exception. I'll mention a little bit about the TV series in a moment, but while I was thinking about it, I wanted to mention that I'm big fans of a lot of his movies too, or the adaptations that have been made into movies. In particular, I have 2 of them. Again, I can't remember if I mentioned Misery already. Great movie. And then Stand By Me, a classic. These are 2 of my all-time favorite movies. And Stand By Me, I just watched with my 2 oldest kids. Hadn't watched it in maybe even a couple decades. Actually, it's been a long time. Watched this a lot growing up. And it was just as good. What was that? 2 days ago we watched it. Just as good now as it was, as I remembered it being all those years back. So if you haven't ever seen this, definitely check it out. Same with this. This one's a little more intense, I would say. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm ready for the kids to see this one yet. But they're both great. So I highly recommend. I don't know. I mean, I know I haven't seen a lot of the stuff that has been adapted from Stephen King, and I know some of it has, it doesn't have the greatest reputation, but a lot of what I've seen actually has been pretty good. So just wanted to mention that while I was thinking about it. So again, back to Under the Dome. I think I mentioned everything I wanted to say in terms of the background, why I'm here and reading this. So yeah, we'll go ahead and move on. I'll say a little bit about, spoiler alert, you will hear a little bit about what the book's about in general. As I usually do, I won't go into too much detail in terms of the plot, just give you kind of a general overview, but you will kind of hence hear, what the book's about in a general sense. And then I'll touch a little bit upon what's going on philosophically, because there is a little bit at play here philosophically, I would say, in terms of what's going on theme-wise, and then a lot of the conflict. It revolves around the very nature of human nature, I'd say, the issue of human nature. More on that here in a moment. So that's what I'll do here. In general, what the book is about, as you can kind of tell. By the way, very cool cover. My kids dig this cover. Doomickey had a great hardback cover as well. But basically what the book's about is this dome all of a sudden, for reasons unknown, slams down around the small town of Chester's Mill. I think population says at the very end, I want to say like 3,000. And so the novel essentially chronicles what takes place after the dome slams down the week thereafter. And of course, none of the citizens know why this happens, we come to find out. The outside world, by and large, doesn't know either. I don't want to say too much or spoil too much, but it's by and large a big mystery. And so you come to meet all these fascinating characters. Then there are a ton of characters in this book, I will say, and so that's one thing that King is known for, is having, and he admits to, is liking a lot of characters and having a lot of characters involved. And Under the Dome is certainly no exception. You get to know a lot of diverse characters, and I think that's especially noteworthy here in this work, in the sense that you're also, as I'll mention more here in a second, getting into the issue of human nature. And so I think it's nice that he then, when we're tackling this issue of human nature, what do we really like at the core, right? What will we really do when, the necessities of life are sparse, and, what will we really act like when crap hits the fan, so to speak? And I think it's nice that he offers us such a wide, diverse range of characters, because I think, I've talked a lot about this in my classes, and I think the truth is that there's a wide range in terms of our underlying human natures. And you might even ask the question then, well, is there even such a common denominator? Is there really such a thing as human nature then, if we're so diverse in our reactions and in our tendencies and so on? So anyway, it kind of spoke to sort of my beliefs in terms of there is no necessarily underlying way that we'd all behave. We're not necessarily all evil or all good. And you really see that play out then with King in this novel, because there is that wide range of characters. Some who have a very good heart, who are always trying to do what's good, if you will. And then others, right, the antagonist here, the villain, if you will. Big Jim Rennie, great villain. Evil to the core, self-interested to the core. So you get that wide range of characters on offer, which I think really would reflect what's true of humanity in general, right? We would have if a dome were to slam down around us, let's say, we would have a wide range of reactions, I think. Some would be extremely self-interested and, you might say, evil and do all sorts of nasty things, where others might not change their behavior much at all. So, again, lots going on. The novel in general chronicles, again, the town and the characters and how they're responding then. And, of course, all kinds of nasty shenanigans play out. You really do get kind of this intense look at, to what extent will people go to get what they want, or maybe even get what they need when push comes to shove in such dire circumstances. What would really happen? And I will say, that general theme really did appeal to me. That's one of the reasons why I came to the book, was I like that idea of what would we do, right? And pondering what would happen if a dome, a weird invisible barrier, just suddenly slammed down right around us. What would we do? It also was fascinating in the sense that you start to think about the scientific implications. Is there going to be weather? Is there going to be rain? And while I'm thinking about it, I thought it was fascinating at the end. I really like reading his afterwards. King talks about how he actually hired a dude to do just a full-blown research guy to research all for the novel, to research all the scientific ecological, various facets of the novel to make sure that they got that right by and large. And I thought that was interesting too, because then as you're going through, like, well, what would happen? Wouldn't this air get really bad? And it does tend to get really bad then towards the end. I don't want to say too much, but something major happens, and basically, yeah, the air is a huge issue. And then what do the resources are, you're getting less and less. Water becomes an issue, and I loved thinking about, well, yeah, what would you have to do? What would it be like in terms of the scientific elements involved under the dome and so on? So I liked how I mentioned, I think, Lord of the Flies. It is kind of a more or less, it's like Lord of the Flies 2, except here you have, it's like, well, Lord of the Flies about what happens when you throw a bunch of kids on an island, remove them from societal structure and government and so on. Well, here it's like, what would happen if you throw a bunch of adults in a similar situation? Not on a deserted island, but let's throw them under a dome, right? Inaccessible dome, and let's see what happens. Kids as well, but adults, and let's see what happens. And so actually, I mentioned in my classes, we talk a lot about Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and Thomas Hobbes, their view of our basic human nature. Are people fundamentally self-interested and just looking after themselves, or do we sympathize with others? Do we want to cooperate? All things, if we don't have to worry about our basic necessities, are we still going to steal from others, or are we good? And Hobbes and Locke, they have this extreme disagreement about these issues, about their basic view of human nature, if you will. While they agree on a lot of things, they have this big disagreement about our basic human nature. And so we'll talk about that in my courses. And so we'll also mention then, so Hobbes is a very, he's a pessimist. If he were to envision what would happen under the dome, it wouldn't be good, right? Whereas Locke's much more of an optimist. People are going to try to get along, cooperate. So long as their life isn't on the line, they're not going to go out and try to hoard resources and so on. So you have like this Hobbes versus Locke, juxtaposition that I talk about in my courses, and that again parallels then William Golding's Lord of the Flies, very pessimistic, right? What transpires is not good if you're familiar with Lord of the Flies. And so Golding lines up with like Hobbes and what Hobbes would say would happen. But Robert Ballantyne is another novelist who I believe wrote The Coral Island, and I have not read that one, but I know it's generally the same sort of theme that's in Lord of the Flies, written before Lord of the Flies, I believe, and what transpires is all good. The kids get along and so on. So that lines up more with Locke. So you have Ballantyne's novel and Locke on one side, Hobbes and Golding's Lord of the Flies on the other. And so this is what I talk about in my classes. We get into like, well, what do we think is true of human beings in general, right? Is Locke generally right, and we tend to want to cooperate and sympathize with others and so on, whereas Hobbes, generally speaking, more correct, and we're only care about ourselves ultimately, and everything we do is, whether we admit it or not, done out of self-interest. Hobbes and Lord of the Flies, that seems to be the implication as well. And so, anyway, a debate that I'm very used to. If you've taken a class with me, we've talked about that probably. And then that again comes out very much here, except it's not kids thrown on a deserted island. Again, it's kids and adults thrown under an inaccessible dome. And so, King says, let's take a look. Let's play this game and see what will happen in such a case. And again, without spoiling too much, you get a little bit of both Hobbes and Locke. You do get a lot of cooperation on the part of the good characters, if you will. You get a lot of self-interested, nasty shenanigans on the part of the villains or the evil characters, if you will. So, and as I intimated earlier, I think that's more or less generally going to be the case, right? If we really press ourselves on what is human nature really like, we're going to get a very wide response, I think, because I don't know that you can pin down people in general to being basically good or basically evil, right? Because it just depends on the person. At least, again, that's my view. Anyway, obviously, very interesting philosophical discussion to be had there, which I, again, have all the time in my courses. So this novel was, Stephen King, you don't necessarily think of his books as being philosophical. And, ostensibly this isn't philosophical by any means, but again, you can't help but think about a lot of those issues. What is human nature really like? What would people really do in such a situation? What would I really do in such a situation? So kudos to King, because he does get you thinking as you're, turning the page to see what happens next. Yeah, I think that's might be all I want to say in terms of what the book's about. It is philosophical in that sort of deep, what is human nature like sense. I did find myself again thinking a lot about that. It was very reminiscent, constantly thinking of again Lord of the Flies, Thomas Hobbes and his view, which I'm pretty familiar with. Thomas Hobbes and his view of human nature, very gloomy view of human nature, as I mentioned. Was constantly thinking about Hobbes versus Locke and that sort of stuff. Things I've talked a lot about when I was reading through this novel. So I'll go ahead and move on to discuss some of my thoughts here. The first thing I would say, or my musings, the first thing I would say is that he's once again a master storyteller. As I alluded to earlier, I was constantly flipping the pages. This is a mammoth book. You're never sure when you try to tackle one of these, whether you're actually going to finish it. And I wasn't sure either, because it is some time, right? I mean, it's a fair amount of time if you want to read a book this big, and it better be good, at least to some extent. And this was no exception. I did really enjoy it. I read 100, 200 pages every day for a while. So I was very much captivated. Like I said, tons of different characters at play, interacting, and so it's what's gonna you always kind of have a view of what's coming next, right? He's teasing you, and so you're like, what's gonna happen when Big Jim Rennie encounters Barbie again. So I should have mentioned. There's a lot of different characters. The main ones are like this dude named Barbie. I actually forgot uh, Colonel Barbara. What is his first name? They usually just call it Dale. Dale Barbara, but they usually just call him Barbie. He's like I would say the main character. The novel starts off with him. And he's definitely, I would say, the protagonist, the main one. But there's several, you might say, primary characters. Big Jim Rennie's the main villain, but he has a son too. Junior, they call him Junior Rennie. So you're following these characters around. You're wondering what's going to happen next. Junior hates Barbie. Barbie's the good guy. He's never trying to escalate anything, so you're always kind of sympathizing with him naturally. Um, just a lot of tense interaction between the characters. And once again, as I've alluded to in at least the previous episode, if not both the previous two episodes, great characters, great character development. You really feel like you're getting to know them. You really start to despise them or hope they do it right and make it, right? Which is the mark of great character development, I think, right? When you're really sort of relating to them, either wanting them to succeed or wanting them to fail, right? Or maybe even get killed because they're so terrible. You definitely have that here, so I appreciate that. Uh, One thing that occurred to me is like him or hate him, you got to give it to King that he comes up with these clever sort of turns, whether it's at various places in the novel or oftentimes in the end. Now, his ending, a lot of people think he has trouble landing those, so to speak, that they're not necessarily that great, but he oftentimes does throw, even if you don't necessarily like the ending or it's not as good as you were hoping for, oftentimes it has there's a curveball involved nonetheless. So I like that where you're never quite sure what he's got up his sleeve, and that's no exception here either. There's some twists and turns that I wasn't necessarily expecting. So one quick example of that, I think, which I was like, oh, that's interesting. Very early on, this happens. So the junior character, he kills, and this won't give away too much. He kills a couple, girls he had grown up with very early on in the novel. Kills them, and he has these headaches, and what actually happens is a brain tumor, and nobody knows about it. So this, underlying influencing factor in a lot of his behavior. But anyway, he has these killer headaches where he can't really think straight, think clearly, and then during these headaches, he actually ends up killing two girls that he grew up with, knew his entire life, and so on. And so this again happens very early on in the novel, and so you're sort of after this happens, his headache clears, and he's like, okay, what am I going to do now? And he, it's revolving around him, and I only have a few options. I either kill myself or I try to escape, and he's down on his luck. What do I do? What do I do? And then all of a sudden he's got this string of good luck, right? Where he thinks he's gonna be found out. Nobody has any idea what's going on. And not only that, then lo and behold, he ends up being assigned as honorary deputy until the dome lifts, right? So he becomes part of the police force. Not only does he not have to kill himself, Not only does he not get caught, but he ends up, being designated basically a police officer and is given a gun, right, and authority more or less to do whatever he wants. So I thought, wow, and that happened very early on. So like, okay, wow, this is going to be interesting, right? You've got a character like this who's basically endowed with almost absolute power at the very beginning. Things are going to get interesting, and they certainly do. So I thought that was like one example of where he kind of like makes things really interesting, right? Throws in a curveball. It's not really a curveball there, but hopefully you can sort of see what I mean. Like, oh, that's an interesting little twist, right? Not only does he not have to escape or cover things up or whatever, but he's now a police officer and basically doing whatever he wants. I'd also mention one thing that occurred to me as I started as I was been reading those last few novels, really getting into King and kind of doing research on him and looking into. I mentioned the movies I already had, but looking into some of the other adaptations. And Under the Dome is a series that came out, I want to say 2013, 2014, 2015. Back then, it lasted 3 seasons. I've only got about 2/3 through the first season. I didn't want to sort of confuse myself because I just finished this yesterday, and so I didn't want to watch too much of that because actually the reason why I'm bringing this up, there is a TV series. It is dramatically different, and actually I really like the way one reviewer that I came across put it. The book and the movie or the series have basically 2 things in common. There's a dome and characters with the same names. Other than that, and there's more similarities in that. Admittedly, there's more similarities in that, but I mean, it is significantly different. And so, on the one hand, it's obviously inspired by the novel. Don't get me wrong, but it's not really true to the novel all the way through. Things are vastly different, as I mentioned. But on the other hand, I kind of like that because then you don't exactly know, even having read the novel, what to expect because things are so different in the series. I wouldn't say the series is great so far, but I've liked it, I've enjoyed it, and I don't know how much of that is because I read the novel and really liked the novel then and kind of knew what was going on and came into it like with that already. I don't know how much of my appreciation of the series is due to that. Like if I just came upon the TV series, never having read the novel, I'm not sure I would even continue watching. So it's hard to say. I don't think it's that bad. But again, I wonder if a lot of that's just because I'm so familiar with the novel. And it's vastly, vastly different. So I mentioned how, for example, Junior kills one of these girls, right? Basically, one of the first things that happens in the novel. Well, he doesn't kill her in this series. I don't want to give too much away, but he basically kidnaps her, and she becomes like a main character. So she, far from dying at the very beginning, she's actually a main character in the TV series. Not to give too much away, but so that's a big difference. I would also say like Big Jim Rennie, the main villain, if you will, in the novel, is much more, at least so far, is much more sympathetic in this series. Whereas in the novel, you just begin despising him extremely early on. He's very much more sympathetic, I would say, in the series. And not only are like the characters doing different things or like significantly different in terms of plot line, but like I noticed even Big Jim Rennie, he abstains from alcohol. It's like not a main theme, but it's a theme in the novel. He's not a drinker, but in the series, he's constantly tipping back on a bottle. So I just thought that's interesting as well that there are, in terms of the main plot lines, there's big differences between the novel and the series, and then even these like little character traits, they, for whatever reason, are completely different in the series versus the novel. And another big difference, what Barbie's doing at the beginning, again, I don't want to say too much, but the series opens up with him doing something completely different, and you're like, what is going on here? Because it's totally different than the novel. So I'll just say that as a teaser, I guess. So yeah, in general, the series is way, way different. Again, same general theme, but way, way different in terms of major plot lines and what's going on. Okay, and I say all that again, admitting that I'm only 2/3 of the way through the first season out of 3. Another thing I wanted to mention, and I appreciate King for, is that as a result of reading these 3 novels, I have actually sort of rekindled my own interest, or that has rekindled my own interest in writing as well. And so I picked up, I've actually written 3 novels way back in the day before I had kids, so 15 years ago. And I started the 4th one. I was about halfway through, and it's been like 15 years in progress here. And so I've really picked it up over the last couple weeks, I'd say. And that's in large part, I'd say, thanks to reading King. And for whatever reason, it just reinvigorated those creative juices. I always have to sort of have to get out my creativity in one way or another. I've created a lot of board games as well, and but in terms of the novels, I haven't really done any of that seriously for like 15 years. It's been a long time. And so again, I picked up the 4th one that I was about halfway through, and so I'm working on that again. I'm really enjoying that. And again, I think I have Uncle Stevie, as I've learned he's referred to by a lot of people, a lot of fans. I have Uncle Stevie, I think, to thank for that as well. So thanks, Uncle Stevie. And I guess one last thing I would say in terms of, I think everything I've mentioned so far in terms of my musings have been positive, and then one more positive kind of thing I'll mention, then I'll rattle off a few knocks or negatives, if you will. So one more positive would be, as I mentioned in the last episode when I was reviewing, or not reviewing, but offering my thoughts on 11/22/63, reading King feels like reading intellectual fiction. It's like you feel like you're getting smarter. Like him or hate him, again, maybe you hate his detail. A lot of people think he's overly detailed. Maybe you don't like his endings. But you can't deny, I feel like, that the guy is smart. And again, I feel like I come away from reading his novels smarter, or like that I'm learning. And so one thing I did as I was reading through this one, I came prepared this time, and I had a dictionary next to me most of the time I was reading this. And so I would constantly be looking up words. And so he's even expanding my vocabulary, which, pretty old at this point. I don't like to think of myself as old, but pretty old. And again, to feel like I'm having my vocabulary massively expanded still. Thank you, Uncle Stevie, for that. So a few, as I mentioned, knocks or kind of negatives that came to mind as I was reading through this. There is, I mentioned this earlier, a lot of characters here, and he admits that he likes, to play with his characters and to have a lot of characters on offer. This one's no different. Again, that probably goes, I mentioned this the last episode when I was discussing 11/22/63, but if you have novels 800 to 1,000 pages, you're probably going to have a lot of characters. Otherwise, I don't know, can you read 1,000 pages on one character? It seems like, if anybody could do it, Stephen King probably could, but I guess the point is, right, it kind of makes sense that there's a lot of characters involved, and this one's no exception. There's a lot of characters here, but one nice thing is he does offer at the beginning this cool map of Chester's Mill, and I was constantly referring to that because characters are going different places, and the geography really does end up mattering for a lot of what transpires. And then he has this very helpful character reference at the beginning, which I was constantly referencing. So that was very helpful. So admittedly, a lot of characters, but I didn't think it was too much. And again, with those helpful resources at the beginning, that helped a lot. I want to say a little bit about the ending. I didn't think it was as bad as some intimated, so I was familiar with what a lot of people had thought of the book and had read some reviews, and a lot of people were very down on the ending. And I mentioned a lot of people are down on his endings in general. I didn't think 11/22/63's ending was bad. Again, to me, that was a little bit of a curveball what happened, and I liked it. It wasn't necessarily the best, and I would say the same thing is true here. I don't think the ending was as good as the rest of the novel, and I would say maybe I found myself generally thinking the last 20% of the novel, let's say 1/5 of the novel, wasn't as good as the first, say 80%, but it was only marginally. It wasn't significant, and while the ending wasn't as good as it could have been, I didn't think it was as bad as some people thought, or as bad as I was expecting because of what these other people thought. So I don't want to say too much about the ending, but I'll just leave it at that. I didn't think it was that bad, and I actually appreciated some of the sort of parallels that were drawn in sort of articulating that ending. Again, I don't want to say too much more than that, but so the ending wasn't great, but it wasn't as bad as some people would have you believe. So I guess I don't know if that's yeah, I think overall it's kind of a negative, right? Because the ending wasn't as strong as the novel as a whole, but it's not as much of a negative as some people would have you believe. I'll put it that way. The last thing, a negative for a lot of people, I think, not as much for me, but I'm not a big fan of it either, because I do think there's something to be said for us being desensitized to things, right? So even though I'm not, so what I'm talking about is there's a lot of gore and graphic stuff happening here. And that doesn't necessarily upset me. Like, I can watch a movie with a lot of that. I don't seek it out. I can read a novel where a lot of that stuff happens. I don't seek it out. And it doesn't really bother me. I'm not a big fan of it because I do think that, again, we can be, no matter who we are, desensitized to some of that stuff. And the more you experience it, whether you think you are or not, the more desensitized you become to it, I think. I think that really is true, and I think science bears that out to some extent. But I don't have as big of an issue with the gore and graphic stuff as some people do, but it's there. And you know what? Maybe, again, what's he supposed to do? If, you think that's, I don't know that he's necessarily saying, hey, this is what's going to happen if you slam a dome around a small city. But let's say if you think that's what's going to happen, you hide the truth because it is gory and graphic. I don't think so necessarily. So there's a lot of nasty stuff happening. So in general, I want to point that out, that especially if that's a negative for you, right? If you're queasy, you don't like that kind of stuff. That is here much more than it was in 11/22/63 or Duma-Key. A lot more nasty stuff happening, vicious, sort of cruel, and touching on like some of the themes I've mentioned in the previous episodes. Not a lot of supernatural stuff going on here. Most of the horror, so to speak, is, again, what's going on between man and man, or woman and man, or however you want to put it, right? Human beings, what they're doing to one another. And that does get very gory and graphic throughout the novel. There's various scenes that are pretty bad. So I'll just throw that out there. I think that's all I wanted to say in terms of my musings, general thoughts on the novel. So I'll go ahead and turn to my book musings grade for Under the Dome by Stephen King. We'll say, I think I mentioned this earlier, this is the longest book I've ever read, and I did finish it, so that's telling you something, right? That it was at least good enough for me to get through it. But not only that, as I've suggested, it was really good. I did really like it. It was a quick read. Even that last 20%, that last fifth, I was still flying through it. I still wanted to see what was going to happen. The anticipation, right, was there. So this really did fire on all cylinders for me. It's the best one I've read so far. So, and you might notice that I've acquired a few more Stephen King books since the last episode too. So, I do have King fever. I mean, they've just gotten better and better. So one thing I've noticed is the three that I've read, Duma-Key, 11/22, and 63, and then Under the Dome, they're all from, when was this one, 07 or 09? They're all from like 07 to 2010, I want to say, or 11/22/63 was written in 2011, I think. But they're all from that 4-year span. So I do want to maybe nibble on some other stuff that's like not in that time span and see what that stuff's like. But again, each of them in succession has gotten better for me. So I want to keep exploring what Uncle Stevie has written. I'm excited. They seem unique too. I talked about how unique 11/22/63 felt to me, and after reading this, I'm like, well, maybe they're all just unique in themselves. He's known for being a horror writer, but there's so much more to each of his novels, I think, or at least so far in my experience. So I've had a lot of great things to say, obviously, about this novel. I'm going to give it a very strong B+, not quite reaching the Book Musings Hall of Fame. I think I can see me reading something that definitely gets there, and maybe even the top shelf. Again, The Stand, which I did acquire, and It. These are the two that are typically held up as his best works. Maybe one of those will hit that top level, right? But this one didn't quite make it. Again, in theory, right, the Book Musings Hall of Fame is supposed to be the top 10%. So really, really good, hence the B+. Not quite as good as, say, Animal Farm or 1984 by Orwell. But this was really good. And it was, again, a really good exploration of our basic human nature, if there is such a thing, as I tried to suggest. Maybe there's not a basic underlying human nature that befits all of us, right? But provides, not only is it a page turner, fiction, work of fiction, but it, again, does kind of satisfy that philosophical nature of mine as well. I was constantly thinking about that battle between Hobbes and Locke. So lots of good stuff going on here. Big fan of Under the Dome. Highly recommend it. The only thing, that I would have in terms of being reserved and recommending this would be just its sheer length. And it does take an investment of time to get through this, but it's great. And if a book's really good, do you really ever want it to end? Why not make it 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 pages? If it's a great book, do you want it to end? I don't know. So even its length, I guess, is that really a reason not to recommend something if it's really good? I would recommend this almost to anyone. I didn't think, even though how long it is, I don't think there's an obsessive amount of detail or unnecessary amount of detail here. Very good novel. I guess I'll leave it at that. I'll end the episode by, as I usually do, just mentioning what might be on tap for me in terms of what I'm going to read next. I was going to try to move on and, read some other stuff, but I feel like, I don't know, I'm really enamored with his works and, again, how different each of them feels. So I'm not quite done, I don't think. And so what I decided to do was actually start at the beginning, or at least start with starting at the beginning. And maybe I'll abandon that. But I thought, because again, I wanted to go and read something outside that like 5 years time span, right? Where those 3 novels I just read, those were all written within like 5 years. I want to go back here. I'm going to go back and read. Did I bring it here? Yeah, Carrie. I started last night. I'm about 20 pages in. This is his first novel, published in 1974. So I'm going to start with this, and the idea is what will be next. Salem's Lot. Go through them in chronological order, and I read that that's actually worth it with Stephen King because there's so many parallels being drawn between the works and Easter eggs and so on that you can find, and you'll have no idea about those if you didn't read the ones that preceded a certain work, right? You won't get the references, and apparently some of these really, really, really do build off prior works. And if you didn't read again the previous Dark Tower series, you're not gonna appreciate. I forgot which one this is true of in particular, but you're not gonna have near the appreciation for that particular work then. So anyway, probably gonna read Carrie. Started on that, and then I also ordered his On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft, which is extremely well reviewed. He wrote that back, I want to say it was published shortly after his accident. He was run over, I think back in 1999. But anyway, he wrote this nonfiction on writing where he talks about the writing process, and extremely well reviewed. And again, I guess it's no surprise that I'm interested in that, given that I've had this interest in my own novels sparked again. I'm interested in kind of going into that and looking into that. I've picking up a copy of that, so I might read that as well. I mentioned this earlier. I have some memory books that I want to take a look at here too. I'll be reading one of these coming up. Also picked up a book on fear that I'm going to be taking a look at here. Really looking forward to that one. And then one guy that I have kept hearing over the years, you've got to check out this dude. You would love his stuff. Finally, it's just like, why don't I pick some of his stuff up and take a look at it? And that's Philip K. Dick. And so I've tried, actually, my kids and I love going to bookstores and used bookstores. And, that's where I acquired my Stephen King collection here, if you will. But trying to find Philip K. Dick, it is difficult to find any of his stuff used. There's like a cult-like following. And for good reason, from what I hear. I've watched a few videos where people go through their collection of Philip K. Dick novels, and just hearing them sort of describe the plot lines is just fascinating. Each of these, the guy was a fascinating man, and he was actually a very prolific writer, much like Stephen King. He wrote tons of novels. I want to say over 40 novels Philip K. Dick wrote. So fascinating guy. Each of his works, again, has really interesting plot lines, it sounded like. So I picked up what I could the last time I went to a bookstore. These three. So he had Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was then famously adapted into a movie, Blade Runner. The Man in the High Castle, this has just recently been turned into a series. Fascinating plotline as well. So I'm really looking forward to diving into Philip K. Dick. Maybe it'll turn into another Stephen King for me, where I just become obsessed with him and start reading all his stuff. I really liked A Scanner Darkly, which is a movie with Keanu Reeves, and I forgot who else is in that. But that's a novel by the same name by Philip K. Dick as well. So another one of those guys where he's had a lot of adaptations of his material made into movies and series and so on that we might not necessarily know. Oh, that's Philip K. Dick, much like Stephen King has, right? There's so many that have been adapted into movies and series and so on. They're just prolific influencers for sure. So Philip K. Dick, definitely want to take a look at his stuff. Also, I mentioned going to be tackling a little bit more ancient philosophy because I'll probably be teaching a course in ancient philosophy here in the near future. So I have an anthology on that I'll be taking a look at. And actually, I just finished listening to the audio version of Plato's Republic on my runs. So I'll be trying to finish. I have been admittedly struggling with the Harry Potter series. I just find it. I know how many Harry Potter fans there are out there, but maybe it's just because it was written for kids. I don't know, but for me, it's just there's a lot of similarity. There's too much, or a lot of what's going on just seems too similar to what's happened in the past. And like I mentioned, I think in a previous episode, the beginnings of each of the books seem to start off the exact same. I don't know. I'll try to, like I told my wife and my kids, I'm going to try to push through. We'll see. But yeah, so I've also read then The Republic, mentioned ancient philosophy. Just finished that and was reminded again how great The Republic is by Plato. If you've never read it, probably my all-time favorite book, at least up there. It's hard to necessarily rank or say what your favorite of all time is. Catch-22 is a very good one, but it's up there. If I was to say like tier one, The Republic is at the top of tier one for sure. So anyway, that's what's on tap. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode again. That was episode 9, where I took a look at Under the Dome by Stephen King, another great novel by him. Not quite reaching the Book of Musings Hall of Fame, but very close, a solid B+. So thank you.